So everyone's talking about the Wicked movie, but if you are a true musical theater nerd, you will recognize this. Litora multum ille, et terris jactatus et alto visuperum saevae memorem unonis ob. If you can tell me what that's from, then I will truly recognize your musical theater credentials. Okay, this is deep musical theater lore for the true nerds out there. If you recognize that Latin that I read, it's because you, like me, I'm embarrassed to admit, were into Spring Awakening as a kid. This is sort of around the time when Wicked was also big, and one reason why I'm a huge hypocrite about Wicked is because it was my peak musical theater nerd time when Wicked, the musical, the stage version, was big on Broadway. I mean, it was huge. And so if you were into musical theater, you probably knew every word of Wicked. I was no different. I was one of those kids. And the reason this makes me an enormous hypocrite is because I actually hate the thing where you take the villain of a movie or a play or a book and you turn the villain into the good guy. You say, oh, actually, he wasn't a villain. She wasn't wicked. She was just misunderstood. I hate this for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's only really two ways that you can do this story, where you take a villain and you turn the villain into the good guy. And one version is where you say, well, the Witch of the West wasn't evil, wasn't the bad guy. Some other guy was evil. Some other guy was the bad guy. And that's kind of how Wicked works. It's like, it's not the Wicked Witch of the West. It's the wizard who turns out to be the evil person. And it's the wizard's minions who turns out to be evil. And isn't that crazy? Which is like, no, that's not that crazy at all. You just replaced one story with one villain with a different story with another villain. And it's not even really a backstory because it ends up altering, shifting the moral balance of the story. And every story has a moral balance. There's no getting out of this. We think that we can tell these nuanced shades of gray, and of course, human life does have nuance and shades of gray, and there is such a thing as a story where we're not totally sure who the villains are, or there are some people who are villains but have good qualities, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, yes, this has been known, for a long time. It's true in ancient literature. It's true in modern works of art. That's not my problem. My problem is that ultimately, at the end of the day, any movie, any story you tell is going to have a moral character to it. There are going to be some good things that people do, and there are going to be some bad things that people do, and there's no getting out of that because that's just the nature of storytelling. Storytelling is not reporting. It's not just this thing happened and then this guy went there and did this. It's experience. It's communicating something about the way life works. And life, the way we actually live it, includes morality. Morality is a real feature of life. It's not a physical feature of life. You can't chart it or plot it, find it on a brain scan, but it's real. It exists. And when we get up in the morning, we go about our day, we say things like, oh man, like she really screwed me over. Like that guy totally cheated and they did that was wrong. And even if we disagree about whether something's wrong or not, our whole lives are motivated by the fact that our actions have moral meaning and moral worth. And so if you're going to tell a story, any story at all, Aristotle tells us the objects of imitation, representation, the things we tell stories about are people in action, people doing things. And that's why storytelling is inherently moral, not because we have to make moral rules about what stories you can and can't tell, but because to tell a story is to talk about and portray human life, and human life as it is actually lived always includes a moral dimension. There's no escaping this. You can't relativize it. You can't wave it away with philosophy. We still live our lives basically as if right is right and wrong is wrong. And so every story, even if a story doesn't have a clear-cut cartoon villain in it, every story is going to have right and wrong. And so the really dumb way that people sometimes try to unmake villainy, to undo the villain, is they say, oh, the Wicked Witch of the West wasn't evil. And actually, nobody is really evil. There's just systems of oppression, or there's your parents were mean to you, or whatever. And you notice it always ends up sneaking the evil in somewhere else. It's some shadowy system, right? But the system had to be made by somebody, so is that person evil? So altogether, I just don't like this trend that we have. I think it's a very modern trend, and it ends up unraveling the logic of all stories, that there are good things and bad things. And some stories, especially fairy tales, like the Wizard of Oz is kind of a fairy tale, depend on telling stories about good and bad people who play the good and bad role, because that's just part of the landscape of the story. You can tell stories where there's moral ambiguity, but you can also tell stories where there are monsters. And if you go around just like reinventing the monsters so that actually the orcs are just misunderstood, or Grendel like just had a nasty mom or something, it doesn't actually do anything except scramble the story and make it cease making sense and make it less like real life. So I hate this whole thing, but however, I can't get over my little 14-year-old self or whatever that was just super into Wicked as a musical and loved singing the songs with all his theater kid friends and went on Broadway. My grandma used to take me to Broadway shows, and so I'm a sucker for it. What can I say? I don't really think it's very good. I can't defend it, but I'm a sucker for Wicked. So I did see the movie. I thought it was a great adaptation of the musical. So if you like the musical, you'll like the movie. But I got thinking about that era. I got taken back to that era of musical theater, which was kind of the spectacle, the birth of the mega spectacle. There were others, of course, before this. There was Phantom of the Opera, there was Les Mis, but really with Wicked, we inaugurated this era of like the spectacle rock musical. And Spring Awakening was one of those. It's about a bunch of kids in Germany that are basically going through puberty. And that is what brings me to the subject of today's episode. This is our translation episode for the week. And in Spring Awakening, if you remember the soundtrack, there's a song that begins with these German school children. And the point is that they're trapped in this lifeless, dull schoolroom with this angry teacher that's just very boring. And they have to recite Virgil's Aeneid. And they're at the very beginning, one of the first verses, and they're going, Litora multum ille, et terris jactatus et alto. And they go through it for a while, and then they go, all that's known, history and science, overthrown at school, at home by blind men. You doubt them, and soon they bark and hound you. I'm not kidding about the musical theater nerd part of me. I still remember all of those lyrics. But the point is that this is actually a real line of Latin verse. And what I want to do today is I want to talk about Virgil's Latin and the opening of the Aeneid, because we are embarking on a series about Virgil's Aeneid. And I mentioned at the end of the introductory episode that I think you should get Alan Mandelbaum's translation if you'd like to follow along with me and you want to read through. I will be doing my own translations, but if you want a book at home, I recommend the Alan Mandelbaum translation, and interestingly, not the Fagles. But one of the things I also love to do on this show is kind of take you behind the scenes a little bit with translation and talk about some of the things that the translators are working with when they sit down to create a new edition of an ancient poem. And so I'm going to do that today just for this opening section that we hear in Spring Awakening. And I'm going to run through a few different translations and kind of talk about some of the issues and say why I like Mandelbaum. But first, I want to tell you about my friends over at Field of Greens. It's the opening of a new year. You know me, I like to stay in shape. I don't really believe in being a brain in a jar. I think the true greats of the intellectual life, and especially of the ancient world, were all in favor of a sound mind in a sound body. And so I take care of my diet. I like to go to the gym, all of that, but I'm human. I don't do everything perfectly. Nobody does. And one of the things that I genuinely do not have time to be doing is getting 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. But it's good for you. Genuinely, I mean, this is like basic, intuitive stuff. You should be eating 5 servings of fruits and veggies a day. Who has time? Not me. So Field of Greens is actually really, really useful because it's a drink that is very carefully calibrated by scientists and doctors to get you the nutrients that you need. It's a staple that you can rely on. Whatever else you maybe fall off the wagon here or there, you have some things that you slip up on. But one of the things that's great about fitness is that if you can get your foothold in a basic thing like Field of Greens, where you're getting these nutrients, you'll start to notice good stuff. You'll start to notice that you have more energy. You'll start to maybe even notice like your hair and your nails, your skin looks better. There's just all sorts of benefits. And once you get a taste of those benefits, you're not going to want to stop. So it's going to help you with a whole bunch of other stuff. They are so confident in this that if you take Field of Greens daily, then at your next doctor's appointment, your doctor will notice your improved health, will comment on it, guaranteed, or your money back. You can ask them for your money back. I don't think you're going to want to. Field of Greens, very, very worthwhile addition to your diet, and you can get a discount when you use offer code HERETICS, HERETICS, at fieldofgreens.com. The website is fieldofgreens.com. The offer code is HERETICS for your discount. Don't wait. It's a great time to go check it out. Okay, the Aeneid. So you are starting the poem for the first time, or you're rereading it as we go through it together on the show. You want to get a translation. What are some of the things you have to think about? Well, one point that I want to make about that spring awakening moment is that it is actually wrong because the kids are not reading the poetry in the original meter with the rhythm. Harumph, I say. Harumph. You should always read ancient poetry with its meter because that's part of the flow of the thing. It's part of the feel of it. Ancient poetry, ancient epic poetry was written in dactylic hexameter. This is true in Latin as well as in Greek. And so in Virgil, unlike with Homer, we're reading Latin, but we're still in that dactylic hexameter rhythm. And it really is a rhythm. It's a way that the different lengths of the syllables are alternated. And it's every line is 6 different chunks. And every chunk either goes da, 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 or da, da. There's a long, short, short rhythm called a dactyl, and there's a long, long rhythm called a spondy, and you put 6 of those together in order, and you have one line of dactylic hexameters. So, for example, the very first line of Virgil's Aeneid is Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris. And hopefully you can hear 6 different, they're called feet, chunks of rhythm. And it's either da 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 or da 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 da. And the whole thing goes on like that. There's an important addition here which you don't have to think about so much in Greek poetry, and that is called elision. When you have a word that ends with a vowel and the next word starts with a vowel, then those 2 vowels get smushed together. And they also don't do this on the Spring Awakening recording, but we have to think about this if we're reading the poem aloud and trying to get a feel for it. So, Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris Italiam fato profugus la vignaque venit, litora multilet teris jactatus et alto, vi superum sae vi memorem unonis obiram. It goes on like that for a while, and we're going to just be looking at that opening section. I sing of arms and a man, this famous opening. And right off the bat, in addition to the rhythm, which you have to think about as a translator, you have to think also about the meaning, obviously, and the many, many layers of meaning that are kind of woven together here. Virgil is a very, very dense poet, and his style, I think, is somewhat more dense. I would call it almost lapidary, which is a great word, meaning it's like rock-like, like it has this sort of marble quality to it, and everything is really solidly packed in here, right down to the very first 3 words. So if you've been with me for the whole series on Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, then you know that each epic poem, each of Homer's 2 epic poems, begins, the first word is the subject of the poem. With the Iliad, it's menis, rage, men Aeneid thea, sing goddess of the rage. And you can already almost hear that there's a more expansive feel to the Greek. Men Aeneid thea peleagio achilleos. But that first word tells you, I sing, or rather, It's actually the goddess, and this is an important difference here. The goddess is being asked to sing about warfare and rage, especially rage, the rage of Peleus Achilles. Goddess, sing the rage. With the Odyssey, it's different. It's andra moi enepemusa, sing a man muse. So both times Homer asks the muse, the goddess of poetry, to sing for him about either warfare, rage in the case of the Iliad, and this one man, Odysseus, in the case of the Odyssey. So bearing that in mind, now look at Virgil's Aeneid. Arma virumque cano. I sing, not some goddess, but me, I sing of arms, that is battle gear, weaponry, warfare, and a man. This is a challenge. This is throwing down the gauntlet. Oh, you sing of rage or you sing of a man in the Iliad and the Odyssey? Well, I sing of them both. I sing of the Iliad, Arma, and I sing the subject of the Odyssey, Virum. One guy, that is Aeneas, and many, many battles when he first left from Troy. So lots going on here, and it speaks to something I mentioned when I introduced this poem, which is that the Aeneid is a little Iliad and a little Odyssey smushed together. So the whole thing is so densely packed, and Virgil continues on that way. This is a very close-packed series of verses that gives you a ton of information all in one. It's using different motifs and ideas from both poems throughout. For instance, in the Odyssey, one of the things we talked about is that although it's about a man, andra moi enepemusa, it's about an Aner, Odysseus himself isn't named until much later on in the poem. And you'll notice that same thing is going on here. It's about Aeneas, but this whole opening section, which talks about the man and what he did, doesn't tell you his name. So there's obviously an imitation there of the Odyssey. There's also this idea of the repetition of the word multum, which in Latin means many. And in the Greek of the Odyssey, we have polla repeated, which also means many, many, many times. Many men he saw, many things he did. Here it's many things he suffered. And then we have these themes of rage, which come back from the Iliad, Eunonis obiram. In this case, it's the rage of the goddess Juno, who is Hera, the wife of Zeus. So as a translator, you have to think about how to deal with all of this. And you have to think about how to untangle Virgil's word order. And because Virgil is packing so much into every line, because the whole point really of this opening is that he's stuffing all of Homer into this little tiny section, this little tiny compass, he uses word order very efficiently. And I've said this before, but if you haven't heard me say this, in Latin and in Greek, you can rearrange words in a sentence really easily. In English, you can't, because in English, the word order of a sentence tells us the meaning. Man bites dog means something different than dog bites man, because you start with the subject, and then you have the verb, and then you have the object. And you can mess around with this a little bit, but you can't mess around with it too much or the sentence stops meaning anything. In Latin and in Greek, there's a different way of telling the meaning of the sentence. It's the endings of words that tell you whether it's the man biting the dog or the dog biting the man. And so the words themselves have their grammatical relations baked into one another, and you can rearrange the words however you like. So you can say arma virumque cano, you can say cano arma virumque, you can say cano virum armaque, you could do any number of different versions of it. Virgil chooses his very carefully, but he doesn't always do it in the order that we need to do it in order to get the meaning across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few different ways the translators have dealt with this opening. There are a gajillion. The Aeneid is one of the most translated poems or works of literature at all in the world. It's actually probably, in the larger history of the West, it's probably drawn more interest than Homer. I mean, it's impossible probably to measure these things, but the Aeneid really did become, that's what Dante picked up when later on the Italian poet Dante uses Virgil as his guide through the underworld. So there's been just uncountable numbers of translations of this into all sorts of modern languages. There is even a webpage called Do We Have Too Many English Translations of the Aeneid? I'll drop the link on YouTube and in the description of this episode in the podcast apps. It's a website called Found in Antiquity. Very, very fun little page by, I think her name is Carla Hurt, and she lists out all of these different English translations and some of their different attributes and their dates, and you can go check all of that out. I'm not going to have time to look at all of those here today, but there are a bunch. And there's one, apparently, I did not know this, there's a C.S. Lewis translation of the Aeneid? Question mark, question mark, question mark. This is a little bit, your mileage may vary, and I have not yet taken a look at it. I've ordered the book, of course. The minute I found this out, I was like, straight to Amazon. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go straight to Amazon and order this 2011 edition of apparently fragments of a translation of the Aeneid by my intellectual hero, C.S. Lewis, that were rescued from a bonfire. But then when I posted about this on Twitter, people were like, actually, this might be an apocryphal story and might be somebody trying to make money off the back of C.S. Lewis. So put a pin in that. I'm going to report back once I've taken a look at the edition, and that'll be another episode down the road of words, and talk about that. But I want to just run through a few of the others and talk about the way that these problems get dealt with. I'll start with one by Shadi Barch, which is fairly recent, University of Chicago, 2020. This is a woman who put out kind of a stripped down, really blunt and forceful version of the Aeneid. And she bears some similarities to Emily Wilson, whom I kind of dragged last episode for being too blunt. Actually, with the Aeneid, this approach works slightly better because Latin is a less ornate and polysyllabic language than Greek. In Greek, you have these chains of compounds and these sort of twisty-turny verses. In Latin, my sense of the verse is that it is much more thudding. It's like a military march or something. And so Barch's translation really kind of brings that out. And here's how she deals with the opening that I just read. My song is of war and a man, a refugee by fate, the first from Troy to Italy's Lavinian shores, battered much on land and sea by blows from gods, obliging brutal Juno's unforgetting rage. He suffered much in war as well, all to plant his town and gods in Latium. From here would rise the Latin race, the Alban lords and Rome's high walls. So, now we're getting into the story. We get a pretty dense beginning here where Virgil tells us what's going on. Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid, is a prince of Troy. He's fleeing from the fall of Troy at the end of the Iliad. That's where the Aeneid picks up. And he's now going to wander for a long time, suffer many things, under the rage of Juno and the force, the power, the vis superum, the force of the gods on high, all so that he can found the Latin race. And that is the basic story. This is the guy who's preserving the Trojan race, bringing it to Italy, and founding what will become the city of Rome, which is now, by the time of Virgil's day, an empire. So the whole story is kind of contained in here. Barch, I think, gets a lot of nice phrases. She also, the word refugee is a translation of the Latin word profugus, somebody fleeing from. Profugus literally means fleeing away from or fleeing from fate. Profugus fato. By fate, he's ordained to be a refugee. And I don't hate it. I used that word recently to talk about Aeneas, but it is a politically charged word, and some might even say it's an anachronism. And an anachronism is when you take a modern concept and you import it back into an older period where it wouldn't have made any sense. It's not that the concept of a refugee is so foreign from the ancient world. It's just that now when we say refugee, we're really talking almost about a political category, and it's so charged with the immigration debate that it almost feels like you are coming down on a side and saying, look, like Virgil's hero is a refugee, so you should let all these refugees into your country. Anybody that claims to be a refugee, you should let. And Barch's introduction kind of helps to confirm this. She makes some political noises about, showing you where she stands on this. So I'm not a huge fan. I think like it's not as bad as the Wilson situation, but with Bartsch, I worry that you're getting a politically pointed translation. But I do like "My Song is of War and a Man." Arma literally means weapons, arms, but war is fair, and it gets across that idea that this is where this is a combination of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't so much like the reversal of word order here. Arma virumque cano, arms and a man I sing. My song is of war and a man seems a little bit too direct to me, actually. In the interest of avoiding ornate, flowery language, she's ended up, I think, kind of ruining the opening, which is supposed to sound like a Homeric opening. It's supposed to sound like the first words are the subject of the poem, and here the first word is my, and then song, and that doesn't quite get it. So Bartsch is fun to read. I enjoy reading Bartsch, but I don't recommend it for some of these political reasons, and also because I think it's probably too blunt. It errs too far in the direction of being blunt. It is in iambic pentameter, the meter of epic in English, and I think that's a pretty good choice. So I don't hate it, but I think there are other better ones out here. Here's Sarah Rudin, who is miraculously a female translator who manages not to talk all the time about being a woman who translates. Imagine that, right? Like, this is a simpler time. 2008, this translation came out. She is, I believe, Rudin, not affiliated with a university. She's just kind of a free-range poet and translator. And she gives you Arms and a Man I Sing. And I think that's still pretty straightforward, but it gets the same word order that we have in the original poem. I'm not so sure about arms. I think one of Rudin's flaws, I like Rudin's work a lot, but one of Rudin's flaws is that she sometimes is a little bit too literal, or she's too concerned with accuracy. She wants to really get across, like, it's not war, it's not weapons, it's arms, right? But I think Arma here is clearly meant to stand in for a larger thing. It's meant to replace Manus, the rage, the battle fury of the Iliad, and I think Rudin is maybe too direct, too precise here. She lets the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to beauty and meaning. But here's the rest of this translation. Arms and a Man I sing, the first from Troy, a fated exile to Lavinian shores in Italy. On land and sea, divine force shook him through ruthless Juno's brooding rage. War racked him too, until he set his city and gods in Latium. There his Latin race rose, with Alban patriarchs and high Rome's walls. So it's more free metrically, and it is more exacting in terms of meaning. So if you're interested in the particular meaning of any given line, whether a translation is accurate or not, one nice thing about Rudin is if you keep it around, if you keep Rudin's translations of things around, you can always look up, even if you don't know the Latin, you can look at what she writes and trust that what she writes is pretty close to the original. And a lot of other translators take way more liberty. So she can be a useful reference if you don't read Latin, but you want to know what the most exact possible translation of a line is. That's helpful. But I don't think that really gets you where you need to go with the poem, because translations have to be a little bit free in order to convey some of the spirit, and some of these lines fall flat. I do really like, I will say, the first from Troy. That's great for primus aboris, Troiae qui primus aboris, and it gets the sense that he was like the very first one to escape, that he was kind of just like at the vanguard of this giant exile and exodus from this falling city. Again, like Bartsch, perhaps a little bit too pedestrian, but useful, and certainly not terrible. Now let's read Fagles. This is 2006. This guy at Princeton, kind of the GOAT in my view. Like, I love Fagles' translations. I love his translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're what I recommend as the gold standard. Here, I'm not as sold on his translation of the Aeneid as I am of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and let me try to say why. Here's his opening. Wars and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil, yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above. thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, and many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Alban lords, and the high walls of Rome. What I don't quite like about this is that it sounds like a Fagel's translation of Homer. And that's funny because I love Fagel's translations of Homer, but one of the things I love about them is that they get the loping, kind of meandering quality of Homeric verse. And you get a little bit lost in the structure of Fagel's lines. It's kind of like a tangled thicket of things. And that happens here too, but that's not really how the Aeneid works. And so it doesn't have the specificity, the exacting quality, the precision that Virgil's poem has. And I think this is a result of the fact that Homer is a singer working with this very, very oral kind of language, and Virgil is a writer, and he's crafting and he's shaping lines, and there's a hairiness to this Fagel's translation that works great for Homer, doesn't work so well for me when it comes to the Aeneid. So, war is a man I sing, in exile, driven on by fate, he was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores. It flows too much. Like, that's a weird thing to say, but it just flows a little bit too much, and the freedom of the meter doesn't work for me as well as it did in Homer. Now here's Alan Mandelbaum, which is the translation I really recommend here. It's the one that I read as a kid, and unlike with the Odyssey, where I started with Lattimore and then moved on to Fagel's, I've never really moved on from the Alan Mandelbaum translation. Here's his opening. I sing of arms and a man. His fate had made him fugitive. He was the first to journey from the coasts of Troy as far as Italy and the Lavinian shores. Across the lands and waters he was battered beneath the violence of high ones for the savage Juno's unforgetting anger, and many sufferings were his in war until he brought a city into being and carried in his gods to Latium. From this have come the Latin race, the lords of Alba, and the ramparts of high Rome. So it's iambic pentameter, which I think really works for Virgil because it is a very definite line. It has these 10 syllables with this alternating stress, and I think if you're going to keep your Virgil restrained the way he needs to be, then that's good to do iambic pentameter. It does reverse the word order of the opening line, so not exactly what I would have chosen. I'm going to read to you my translation in a second, but there are just so many great turns of phrase, and it's so solemn in a way that I think Virgil is. The high ones, his translation of superum is so evocative. These are the gods. The we superum is the power of the high ones, but I just think to leave it that way, kind of unexplained, leaves that ambiguity in there. It leaves a kind of echoing silence and uncertainty that I think really works for Virgil. And I just noticed, actually, that some of these turns of phrase have worked their way so deep into my mind that when I was translating this passage, because I wanted to do my own translation, I suddenly found that some of Mandelbaum's phrases had actually stuck with me, and they ended up coming out in my translation too. So I didn't realize this, but I was like ripping off Mandelbaum. So really great translation is Mandelbaum's. His Dante is also really good, but this is the one that I would recommend. I just think it's like Goldilocks. Like, this one was just right. It gets the stately, processive quality of the verse without getting hairy the way Fagel does. It's direct and intelligible without being too down to earth like Bartsch or Rudin. And I just think it's kind of got, this club has everything. It's got all the qualities you want. Now I'm going to read you mine because you're going to get my translations as part of this series too. And I always like to do that, not because I think I'm going to do a better job than Mandelbaum, but because it helps me to engage with the poetry, and I hope it helps you to hear it for the first time again. One of these days I will do a full translation of some epic poem, but for now, just the ones that I really study with you, I'm going to translate myself. So here's my version. Warfare and a man. I sing of the first from the shores of Troy, chased out by fate to Italy and Lavinium, where at last he came ashore. So many things, on land and on the deep, under almighty hands, by savage Juno's unforgetting rage, he suffered. In war as well, so many things, to found a city and bring his gods to Latium, from which the Latin race and Alban fathers and the walls of Rome leapt up. However you slice it, it is just a terrific opening. It packs so much into so little space, and it does so very pointedly, very purposefully, because what we're doing here is we're saying all of that tradition, all of that stuff is getting packed up and boiled down into this little small compass, kind of like a refugee who has to pack up his whole culture and get all the most essential elements he can from the past and bring it forward into the future. That's what Aeneas has to do when he packs up his stuff to leave Troy. He has to get the most essential things. That's what Virgil has to do as Greece is ending and Rome is entering into this new age. He has to pack up all of the glory of Greece and get it down to just its bare essentials and deliver it as he carries things forward into a new era. So we're going to pick up with book 1 of the Aeneid next time, but I thought it would be fun to keep a running commentary on translations as we go. So this is Words, Words, Words. Thanks for joining me. As always, if you've got questions, write in at rejoiceevermore.substack.com, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.